Now, a couple quick things right at the start. First, there are going to be some spoilers for Season 8 of Game of Thrones up through Episode 4 in this video. Second, no, I'm not about to start full on covering the show here on this channel at the end of its run. I may do another in a few weeks after the final episode, but that'll likely be about it. And finally, yes, I am a huge fan not only of the show, but of the books as well, which I read shortly after the first season aired on HBO. And like a lot of fans out there right now, I do feel like there has been a slow, steady decline in the, shall we say, overall greatness of the show, and some leaks have sprung in the storytelling since it ran out of books to work from, and now here in the final season, those leaks have pretty much become a dam breaking. And no, I'm not just going to rant about how I hate the show now or how everything in it is wrong, because for the most part I do still enjoy it. Instead, I'm going to discuss 3 of the things that once made it great, that separated it from pretty much anything and everything else out there, and how all 3 of these things have, especially here at the end, become a problem for the show. And as I often like to do, I will be comparing and contrasting it against Star Wars a little bit, another franchise that has seen problems with its fan base. Okay, that long-winded preamble out of the way, what made Game of Thrones so great in the first place? Why has it become one of the most popular shows in history? Well, setting aside some of the more impressive surface level things like great acting, high production values, beautiful visuals, good use of CGI, and so on, the first thing that made it rather unique for a fantasy show is that the quote-unquote magical part of it is, or was, ever so subtle. It felt like a natural part of the world that was just sort of there. It's not something that anybody and everybody can tap into and use on a whim. There aren't crazy, powerful wizards running around doing extraordinary things, or gods overtly pulling the strings of all the characters like puppets. No one has magical items or artifacts, for the most part, that they use to do silly or ridiculous things. Instead, it feels like a world full of regular old human beings that happens to have some degree of magic in it, and mostly left over from a bygone era. And those who do use magic usually use it in very small, simple, and subtle ways that comes off feeling more like tricks than actual magic. And when something truly magical or spectacular does happen, like Daenerys walking into the fire and hatching once stone dragon eggs, it feels like something truly amazing and awe-inspiring, even to us, the audience. Because just like most people in that actual world, as we're watching the show, we too are questioning and wondering whether or not magic or the gods are real, and if so, to what extent. The world of Game of Thrones initially feels, in that first season especially, a lot like our own world, where many of us want to believe that fantastic or even magical things actually could or do exist, but they're just out of our view or beyond our understanding. And this way of handling magic is similar and works as well as 2 of my other favorite franchises of all time, those being Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, who also made magic, or the Force, feel like this natural part of the world or galaxy that not everyone could tap into, and that a lot of people either don't believe it was real or just never thought about it because it doesn't affect them and they never encounter it in their day-to-day lives. And even those who did use it weren't using it in crazy or extravagant ways or all the time. Gandalf wasn't blasting the crap out of every enemy they came across with fireballs. And until the Emperor started to zap Luke with lightning at the end of Return of the Jedi, the Force had pretty much just been used to move stuff around, sense a few things, and maybe fool a weak-minded person or two. In other words, in all 3, it was the possibility of what this magic or force could do that actually intrigued us and drew us in. It was the mystery that we loved, not actually seeing all of it, because the more we see of it and the more it gets used in increasingly more incredible ways, the less awe and wonder there is around it, the more mundane the once amazing begins to feel, until it just becomes more like a standard fantasy world and not something special anymore. And though it's not commonly cited as one of the main problems with the Star Wars prequels, the abundance of Jedi using the Force kinda ruins some of the magic of the originals. Yeah, it's cool to see all these Jedi at the height of their power using the Force, but, and maybe I'm alone in this, but I'd always imagined long before the prequels ever came out, that there were only a handful of Jedi around before the rise of the Empire. Maybe a couple dozen of them at most, not 10,000. And these few Jedi more or less roamed the galaxy, handling the greatest of threats that might arise, not negotiating trade disputes. And when we're told that Vader hunted down and destroyed the Jedi, I thought that meant he himself systematically hunted down and destroyed all the Jedi roaming the galaxy, and one by one just killed them all, other than Obi-Wan and Yoda, of course, who somehow managed to escape him. And that way the tone or the feeling of the prequels may have been a bit more in line with the original trilogy, but whatever, I do like the prequels for what they are. They're just not what I expected them to be. And now the sequel trilogy is going back to the Force being this more rare and barely seen or used thing. However, it's being used in more powerful ways than ever before. Anyway, getting back to Game of Thrones and how it handled magical evolution, if you will, or how it slowly but surely brought more and more magic to the forefront, while for the most part I do think it's been handled rather well. I wish the curtain on some things hadn't been pulled back quite as much as it had been, as early as it had been, like when they went north of the wall to capture a zombie, but hey, they needed an excuse to send a dragon north of the wall so the Night King could have a dragon too. And though the show from the very start, from the very first scene, has been building to the White Walkers eventually invading Westeros, the episode The Long Night where the dead attacked Winterfell has, in a sense, and no pun intended here, made the world of Game of Thrones feel completely overrun with magic now. It's lost that grounded and realistic feeling, and for the life of me, I really can't understand why the show didn't end with all of that and, again, show us less of the White Walkers until the very bitter end. Instead, now for the final few episodes, we just forget all about the White Walkers, the gods, Bran who can see everything, and all of this other magical stuff that was unveiled to us, and go back to this non-magical world where Cersei sits on the Iron Throne, and we have to deal with the mundane and ordinary again. We even have one less dragon now, since one of them got shot out of the sky by what had to be some of the best shooting in the history of anything, as it was nailed from who knows how far away with 3 successive shots, and even Legolas would have raised an eyebrow at that one. And if you do have that good of aim, why not first take out the dragon Daenerys was riding on, hence taking her out as well? Anyway, it surprised me that the show didn't end with the magical crescendo, you could say, that the army of the dead never got past Winterfell and they were defeated in one single night, and that again, the final few episodes will be a fight over who gets to be the one who sits on the throne the last, or at least the last that we'll see. Because the Game of Thrones will likely never end, because no matter who sits on the throne, there will almost certainly be those scheming to take it from them, and in my opinion, it would have made more sense if the dead had all but overrun the whole of Westeros, and it was only some last-ditch effort by Jon or Daenerys or both of them that saved everyone who was left. And the show then ended in a way that implied there would no longer be 7 kingdoms, but just one, or something like that. Something that felt more definitive than we'll likely get with the White Walkers now having barely done anything to impact the rest of the world outside of the North. Okay, moving on now to the second thing that separated Game of Thrones from the crowd, as well as what separated the original Star Wars trilogy and Lord of the Rings 2, I suppose, and it very much goes along with the first, and that is how real these characters feel, how well conceived and fleshed out they are, and how they fit perfectly and naturally into the story and their fantastic world. And thanks in large part to George R.R. Martin not wanting to use classic tropes and character types, they don't feel at all like standard fantasy characters as much as they feel like actual people who just so happen to find themselves in a slightly different type of world from our own. And though in Game of Thrones some of the characters are clearly better people than others, if you will, even good characters do bad things from time to time, and the bad ones can do noble or good deeds as well. In other words, there's a great deal of moral ambiguity here, which makes the story feel even more real because these characters don't act according to defined character types or roles. And each truly feels like their own individual with their own motives and set of beliefs, or lack of beliefs, which isn't at all like Star Wars, where we're basically just told that the rebellion is good and the Empire is bad, and that's the end of the discussion, at least in the context of the original trilogy. Yes, there are characters like Han Solo who start out a bit more gray, but in Game of Thrones, almost every character is muddled in the massive middle and just lean either heavily or slightly to one side or the other. We're never really told who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. The story oftentimes lets us choose or decide who we think is right, or maybe what might be the lesser of two evils in some cases. And these amazing characters tie directly into the third reason why the show was so great and why it's starting to slide. Because in most, if not almost all other fantasy stories, the characters are overtly used to serve the plot. In other words, it's almost always plot-driven storytelling in fantasy, not character-driven. To put it very simply, fantasy stories are usually all about a group of characters trying to save a kingdom from a terrible ruler, for example, or maybe saving the whole world from some type of great dark threat that might have been long since forgotten until just recently. And this is where you might say, wait a second, isn't Game of Thrones at its core about trying to get an evil tyrant off the throne and stopping the great threat of the White Walkers? Doesn't it actually have a very, very familiar plot to most fantasy when you break it all down and look past the characters? Well, yes, actually it does. But the big difference is all of that is merely used as a setting or a backdrop for these characters to interact upon or within. And yet it's handled so well that somehow this fully character-driven story never makes its overarching plot feel diminished or like there's no greater stakes to everything we're watching or reading. The actions of the characters always impacted and dictated the plot and kept driving the story forward in unique and very interesting ways. And once upon a time, it never ever felt the other way around. It never felt like the characters had done something or something had happened just to serve the plot or overall story. It was, in my opinion, primarily this that always made this show fantastic and a cut above anything else in the fantasy genre. Every twist or turn felt fully earned and not contrived in the least, because it was just characters acting as we would expect them to act because of the way they had been set up. And at times, it seems to radically alter the course of the show and its plot. The Red Wedding would be a great example of this. It was a crazy twist that changed everything, but it didn't feel contrived or forced or like subversion just for the sake of shocking or surprising us, the audience. It just felt like what would actually happen considering the motivations of all these characters involved, which in turn is why it was so great. It felt like a believable and truly earned twist, albeit a heartbreaking one for the fans of Robb Stark. And that's how the books written by George R.R. Martin and the first few seasons of the show always felt. Believable, like nothing was ever being done just to serve the plot. Like these characters were even independent of it in a way, as they schemed and did their own things with their own interests in mind. Like we weren't actually building to anything, as much as we were simply watching all these lives unfold, while the inevitable arrival of the White Walkers drew closer and closer. The problem with the show now, especially here in the last season, and is likely also part of the reason why George R.R. Martin is struggling to finish his book The Winds of Winter, which will be the second to last book in the series, is you now have to do with this story that which you actively were avoiding doing all along. And that is using these characters not only to further the plot, but to finish it. You now have to find a way to end these characters' arcs that had never really felt like traditional character arcs at all. Again, it's always felt like we were just following their lives, which isn't to say that there hasn't been growth or development, but it's happened far slower and more naturally than it usually does in stories. And sometimes it doesn't really happen at all, and characters never really change no matter how much they go through or how many reasons they have to change. However, now things are very obviously being done for the sake of the plot. Now characters are purposely being driven in certain directions for the sake of finally finishing up this massive story full of so many different characters. And because of this, plot conveniences and plot armor now abound. Whereas it once felt like any character could die at any given moment and in the most unceremonious and horrible of ways, now the showrunners are trying to finish up the story in a satisfying way, which means at times very obviously steering characters to where they need them or want them to be in order to finally wrap things up, instead of where they might end up if just left to their own devices, which is what always made the show so great. The natural slow pace of the story is gone. The randomness feeling of events and character actions have now been streamlined and focused down to singular big moments where everyone is together with just one goal. And in defense of the showrunners here, there's no way to really end this story without doing a bit of character railroading, unless they would have gone the route I was suggesting before and had the White Walkers pretty much overrun all of Westeros and kill almost all the main characters at different times and places, and we would get to see how each character dealt with what was amounting to an apocalypse. We would have seen who ran, who fought, who lived, who died, and how. And so now this show doesn't feel like it's ending in the natural way it's always unfolded, and worse yet, now subversive moments like a dragon being shot out of the sky don't feel earned or shocking. They feel frustrating because we can see it was only done to serve the plot, to limit Daenerys' capabilities for the final battle. Just like when the Dothraki were foolishly sent charging into the darkness against the army of the dead, it was actually done just to serve the story, to thin out their numbers for the coming battle at King's Landing. It was done for future drama, not because it made any sense in the moment. And this is all happening because they're now working backwards. They've come up with an ending to the story, and they now need to aim everything in that direction instead of letting the characters move about as they would normally and letting events unfold in a natural way. And to make one final Star Wars comparison, it's one of my biggest complaints with The Last Jedi, in fact, how the character decisions feel like they're being made to serve the plot, to get everyone and everything together for the final confrontation on Crait. Meaning it feels like Rian Johnson worked backwards. He knew how he wanted to end the story and then did what needed to be done to get all those characters there, even if not everything made complete sense, which is exactly what is now happening with Game of Thrones. And I feel like when they decided Season 8 would be the last, that there was some sort of meeting of the minds behind the show about how do we end this thing? And they asked themselves, do we opt to give fans a realistic ending that many of them might not actually like, but that may just be acceptable because it's how the show has always been, and that a lot of other fans might actually really appreciate, despite how grim it likely would have been? Do we go with the ending where many characters simply die in less than heroic fashion as the White Walkers swarm south, or do we try to give this show a somewhat happy, satisfying ending, even if it means going against what it's always been? Do we let things like Gilly and Sam ride off into the sunset together expecting a child, or is Sam maybe one of the first casualties of the long night because he did little more than lay down and cry? Do we have Brienne and Jaime hook up, or do we have them die fighting side by side with each other, even though that would rob us again of them hooking up, and would also rob us of Jaime getting a final encounter with his sister probably in the very last episode? And it seems rather obvious what they ultimately picked. They're going for the satisfying ending, though I'm sure there will still be some deaths and twists and turns to come, and hopefully they'll feel earned and natural and not just convenient for the plot or the ending that they want to give us. And look, again, I don't mean to attack the showrunners. I actually do feel kind of bad for them, and I don't envy the task of having to finish this show. And one way or the other, they were going to anger some fans with however they wanted to end this thing no matter what. But to me, it feels like they've embraced fan service here at the bitter end, and this show has always been anti-fan service, which is why so many have loved it, and why so many are now turning from it. And as I've discussed before in other videos regarding fan service, there are certainly times and places, or shows or movies, where some degree of fan service is fine and even appreciated by me. But it's not appreciated here, at least not by me. And the best way I can describe how I feel on this matter is to say that as unfulfilling as it would have been to some people, or as silly or as senseless as this might even sound, I just wanted the show to have an end, not to be given an ending. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me how you feel about Game of Thrones. Do you still love it, and maybe you love it more than ever here in the 8th season, or has it lost something for you along the way? Let me know in the comments below, and let's talk some Game of Thrones. And until next time, thanks for watching.